Okay, so this is my name. Unless you remember the times of the Russian Empire being around Tampere, you probably can't read this. So it looks like this in English, but it's not Bozhidar, it's Bozhidar. You can shorten this to Bozo, which is cool. Bozo is not a bozo, hopefully. Yeah, more Russian-looking letters, that's fucked up. But you can think of me as Bug, because this is how my friends have been calling me for a very long time, ever since I was caught cheating on a Bulgarian language exam many, many years ago. For a Bulgarian, I kind of suck at Bulgarian. The important thing is that I'm not known as Bug, not for the quality of my software, or at least I hope so. So, yeah, I come from the sunny city of Sofia, Bulgaria. Even when it is not very sunny, it looks kind of like Tampere. Funny enough, when I came from Sofia, it looked like this. Then I came to Tampere, it looked like this. I hope that you have really good alcohol here. Otherwise, it'd be hard for you to survive, right? Yeah, this is Sofia in the winter. This is in February. I have no idea what Tampere looks like, but I guess it has a lot of snow. I'm not a Clojure developer. I'm a Ruby developer. And at Ruby conferences, we are not like you. We don't really say meaningful stuff. We have a lot of jokes. So I'm going to tell you a few funny things, very little important information, and I'm going to hope that you're going to walk out of this talk with positive emotions, or you can walk out now and drink something, because you wouldn't miss much. So the most important things about me. I love bears very much. Bears are my most favorite animal in the world, and I love them even more than Clojure. I'm an Emacs fanatic. I am convinced that this is the one true editor that is going to bring balance to the source, and nobody can convince me otherwise. Another very important thing, I'm extremely excited to be here because this is my first time at Clojure 3, which means that I'm for the first time in Tampere, for the first time in Finland. Exciting times for me. I was actually so excited that instead of working on my presentation, I spent the last couple of days walking around Tampere. So my presentation kind of sucks, for which I apologize. I work at TopTel, and I have to thank my employer for paying for this trip here. I appreciate it, guys. You are awesome. But for you, more importantly, I do a lot of open source work, or at least I was doing a lot of open source work because before I got depressed with my life and started drinking all the time, which happened a few years ago. So some of the open source work I've done that you might know are I'm the editor of the Ruby and Rails community-driven style guides, and I have written a tool that enforces consistent style practices for Ruby and Rails projects. I have written a ton of Emacs plugins, and I'm a member of the core committer team on Emacs, so I've written some code there. And one Emacs project of mine that you might have heard of is Cider, a Clojure interactive development environment for Emacs, which is also the best one there is. And that's objectively true. Many things in life are subjectively true, but this is subjectively true. You should trust me. I'm also the editor of the community Clojure style guide, and this kind of ties in with the subject of my presentation today. We are going to talk about awesome Clojure documentation. And I know what you're thinking. There cannot be a more boring topic than documentation, but I'm a very boring person in general, so it kind of goes hand in hand. I know what you're thinking. We are developers, developers, developers. We are sweaty, but also mighty. We have the power of the source. And because we have the power of the source, we can supposedly write clean and simple source that doesn't really need documentation, right? Because it's apparent what it does. And let me show you some clean and simple source code from the Clojure standard library. This is map, a function as simple as it gets. I can talk a lot about the implementation of this, and some of the odd names used in it. But I can assure you that you are going to take a while to understand the code, but if you focus on those 5 lines of really poor documentation, you are definitely going to get further along in your journey to understand how map works. The implementation actually was quite simple before transducers. I'm still not convinced that anybody needs them, but I'm convinced that they had really negative impact on the implementation of some core functions. So, still, documentation looks kind of useful, but developers hate writing documentation, right? And I guess that's true. But I would speculate that only bad developers hate writing documentation, even though this is the bulk of the developers out there. When I was young, I was a huge fan of the DuckTales show. I don't know if you had it in Finland. I guess you know, Uncle Scrooge, Huey, Dewey, Louie. Does this ring any bells? Yeah? Yes, no? Maybe? Okay, so I was very young, and Uncle Scrooge was my role model in life. He was so wise. Once Huey asked him, Uncle Scrooge, why is gold so precious? Uncle Scrooge looked at Huey and said, because it is rare. Rare things in life are precious. And this is also why some developers are better than others and precious, because they write documentation. Yeah, I deserve the applause. In my favorite programming book, Structure and Interpretation of Computer Programs, which you should totally read one of those days. Here you have many rainy and snowy days, so a lot of opportunities for you to read it. It is written that programs must be written for people to read and only incidentally for machines to execute, which means that we should really take any opportunity to make something easier for humans to understand. And trust me, most humans understand English and Finnish, not really Finnish, but English for sure, faster than source code. So documentation is a force for good. And developers who write good documentation are heroes of the federation, heroes of the community, good people overall. I'm about to get serious. There are 2 important points in my talk. One is the state of the Clojure documentation and how we can make it better. By this I mean the Clojure project. And the other is how we can make better Clojure API documentation. So, is Clojure's documentation awesome? The answer is simple and definitive and objective. No. It sounds a bit depressing, but let me elaborate on this to convince you. Let us look at Clojure.org, the home of the Clojure documentation, the Clojure project, and so on. This is the getting started page of Clojure, and that's not a joke. You can check it. This is what we have for getting started. Minimal install, try Clojure online, Clojure with Leiningen. Kind of arbitrary. Going to another project, the Elixir language, this is their getting started article. It has 22 chapters, and it actually makes sense. Looking at some of the random articles on the Clojure.org website, you have some articles about basic things in Clojure, and out of the blue, you have a random article, Go block best practices. So if you haven't heard of core async, which is not part of Clojure per se, how would you even know what this is? No description, no explanation, general advice, do this and this. It's really strange. Checking the API documentation of Clojure, which is posted on Clojure.org, something super simple, the when macro evaluates test. What is test? If logical true, evaluates body in an implicit do. What is this? Really? Think about this. If you weren't Clojure developers, does any of this make sense? I'm going to show you something different, but for instance, in ancient languages like Common Lisp and Emacs Lisp, a macro would have a one-line description, showing what it really does. There would be some ways to spot references, parameters, and so on. Clojure.org sucks so much that there are several efforts to provide people with better documentation. Clojure Docs focuses on providing better API documentation provided by the community. Clojure Doc, similar name, it's very confusing, aims to provide better reference documents. Conch.io, also known as Grimoire, tries to do the same as Clojure Docs, the first, not the second. I know, this escalated quickly, and there are other projects, other efforts. The existence of those efforts, which usually don't exist for other languages, is a clear indication that something is really wrong with Clojure's documentation. There are several problems at large, the most important and apparent being that Clojure's core team doesn't care much about documentation. And I really sugarcoated this, because I don't know whether it is okay to use profanities here or not. My actual opinion differs from this. So it is really hard to contribute simple documentation fixes. The core team doesn't care, but we care. But they make it very, very hard for us to do it. You have to sign a contributor agreement. You have to sign up on Jira. You have to submit a Jira ticket. You have to wait for 6 months for somebody, for 3 people to review the typo you found or the docstring that you extended. That's absurd. I think that we would really benefit from somebody relaxing the rules for documentation improvements. Those are the steps that I would suggest. Don't require the CA for them. Accept documentation improvements via GitHub. We shouldn't make the lives of people trying to help harder. Okay, if they care so much about the code, that be it. But for the documentation improvements, I think we could have some less hurdles we have to jump through. And we should have a simplified review process for doc improvements, something like thumbs up, press the magic merge button. The Clojure project evolved a bit ever since Alex Muir joined Cognitect. He has really been trying, but I guess some people there are making it hard for him. The important thing is that Clojure.org itself now accepts pull requests, and it is easier to work on the manuals there, and God knows that they need a lot of help and support from the community. I'm saying this because I assume that many of you don't know it. The Clojure project itself still doesn't have those improvements, I'd say, to the contribution process. Moving to the second point, API docs. Does Clojure provide us with the means, the infrastructure to create awesome API documentation? The answer, unsurprisingly, yeah, you saw this coming. So why is this so bad? I'd argue that the docstring format in Clojure is very bad. It's, in fact, the worst docstring format I've ever seen in a programming language. There are absolutely no clear formatting rules. If you take a look at the Clojure code itself, half the docstrings are using some different conventions. When it comes to indentation, when it comes to the structuring of the text, dealing with references, and so on. It's not even apparent whether you're supposed to capitalize docstrings and use punctuation there, which is kind of strange. They're not editor-friendly. In many other languages, the first line of a docstring would be something standalone, holding the essence of the thingy, so the editor could extract this and present it to the users. You might have seen something like this in Emacs, in the mini buffer, pretty useful. There is absolutely no way to discern what is a parameter in a docstring, what is a reference to another var, to something like this. It's crazy. And let me show this to you. This is the definition of the str function in Clojure core. I will focus just on the docstring. And let's see this. With no args, returns the empty string. What the... Oops. I was about to say something that I'm not. So what does this mean? It's strange. With one arg x, maybe x is the name of the argument, maybe it's something else, returns x to string. Is this some Java code? What is it? Str new returns the empty string. I'm getting more and more confused. Let's compare this to the ancient language known as Emacs Lisp. Ancient but wise. So the first line of this function actually makes sense on its own. Evaluates form and dispatch the response to callback. It's clear that form and callback are some parameters because they're written in a different case. Oh, some reference to another function. That's useful. And you can probably even click on this and it is going to take you somewhere. Whoa, that's amazing. Going back to the first line, that is something self-contained, and the punctuation is apparent. The way you have to indent this and structure it is apparent. So if you take the wisdom from Emacs Lisp, we could convert str's documentation to something like convert something to a string. Okay, that sounds good. With no arguments, returns the empty string. With one argument X, returns some code reference. I'm using just Markdown here. But I think that it really makes a difference because your editor can highlight this. It can create hyperlinks. It is really, really useful. Otherwise, it's just guesswork and you. Moving forward, it's not just about vars. That there are also namespaces. In Clojure in general, we have this habit of not documenting namespaces at all. A classic example from Clojure itself, the Clojure.eden namespace, doc eden reading. Whoa, that's insightful. Auto-rich hickey, that's useful. And I really think that we can do better, and that's another example from Clojure. This is the documentation of the string namespace. It is extremely useful, well-detailed, some architectural decisions, how are you supposed to require the namespace, and so on. It didn't take the author a lot of time to write this, but it really saved a lot of time for the people who actually read it. And of course, this could have been improved a bit if somebody actually updated the Clojure internals to match the newer versions, because namespaces support natively docstrings for a few versions of Clojure, but that's something else. I'm a very bitter man, and I complain a lot. Another complaint of mine, there are several def macros in the Clojure language that don't support docstrings directly. And there is no reason for this, but because they don't support docstrings, people usually don't bother with using metadata. And often if you're using something like def1s, it wouldn't have any documentation. So yeah, you can have the doc metadata, but many people don't know this or don't care about this. And it's just something really simple to change. And of course, why is this sentence not ending with a full stop? I'm such a bitter man. I should stop. So this shouldn't be hard to fix. We don't have any unified conventions about documentation-related metadata usage. How do you handle deprecations? Who knows? How do you indicate when something was introduced or changed in a namespace? In the Clojure standard library, often we would see something like the use of the added and the deprecated metadata keywords. And this is pretty good, but this was never standardized. And because it's never standardized, not all of the editors, CIDs, and so on would do some special things with such metadata. So I think we can definitely do better than prefixing docstrings with huge deprecated letters and leveraging better the metadata. And there are other aspects where the metadata can really help us. For instance, how do you tell an editor the preferred way to indent something? If you've looked at the code of many of the editors out there, you'd see that a huge list of macros has some hard-coded indentation specifications, and it really sucks. Can't we just adopt some metadata about this? This would be something pretty good. And I think that some common metadata for namespaces also makes a lot of sense. It's not like you can't deprecate an entire namespace. It's not like you won't be adding a namespace in a particular version of a project. So that's pretty cool. I think that some common metadata that we should settle upon is something like version edit, version compatibility broken, version when something was deprecated, superseded by. This could be a reference to another var that replaced something that you deprecated. We could have standard metadata C also. This could be a list of related functions, macros, whatever, and an indentation specification. I think that this is very important, even though people really don't speak about it, because as the writer of cider and the maintainer of Clojure mode, I have spent a lot of time thinking about this. Cider understands something which we call the universal indentation metadata specification. Basically, you can add style indent to any macro, and you can say how many special arguments it has before the indentation becomes special. So here for this within string, it's 1. And it is going to be indented automatically like this. Otherwise, it is going to be like this. For something like do, there are 0 special arguments, so it is going to be indented like this. This document, this is a big article in the cider documentation, so you can read it later. But I think that many tools can benefit from these tools like CLJ format, every Clojure editor and IDE out there, and this is pretty cool. So I'm just going to wrap in a minute, because I said a few things, but what does this change? Mahatma Gandhi once said that you must be the change you wish to see in the world, and I can tell you that you must be the change you wish to see in the code. So I have come to the situation that I'm quoting myself, which either means I'm a jerk or I said something very deep and profound. The Clojure team is not going to make this happen for us. We should make it ourselves. We should codify the best practices for documentation. We should send a ton of documentation patches to Clojure and every prominent Clojure project out there, because this is going to create a ripple effect. Sharing the best practices and your experiences with them is the only way that this is going to spread across the Clojure community. I don't want us to be the community derided for the poor state of its documentation. Let's make Clojure's documentation better together. And no, better is not enough. Let's make it awesome together. That's pretty much all I have for you. Have a wonderful day. Take care.
All right. Thank you, Bozhidar. I will allow one question, if there is. Yeah.
Hi, thank you, and first of all, thanks for cider. It makes my life amazing. And I have a question for you. Have you heard of a project called Codocs? It's a lining and plugin that automatically generates documentation.
Of course. That's a great project, but for it to generate good documentation, somebody should write the good documentation. Codocs can get us so far. But if the source material is not any good, it doesn't help us much, right? But Codocs expects certain conventions, and because of this, I think that it sets people on the right path. I guess this is why you mention it. But I think that all the tools should settle on a common set of conventions, and we should all be abiding by them.
You think the assumptions it makes for the format of the documentation, is it too much for something like the developers of Clojure itself to accept?
Well, the Clojure developers don't even write unit tests. I don't know how many people have seen the Clojure code base, but it is very bad. It is extremely inconsistent, poorly tested. Have you seen a commit message by Rich Hickey?
Yes.
Yeah, so it's too much for them.
I see. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Bozhidar.
Thank you.